Hi all, and welcome to our special Domestic Violence Awareness Month edition of our webinar series. This month we're going to be talking about stalking, so we'll get right into it. First, a little warning that some of the content that you're about to hear could be a bit upsetting, so please practice good self-care and step away or pause the playback if you need to. And also just to acknowledge that the Women's Resource Center is located on Treaty 2 territory, and we also operate on Treaty 1 territory. These are the lands of the Anishinaabeg, Cree, Oji-Cree, Assiniboine, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and comprise the homeland of the Red River Métis Nation. So let's go through what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to be talking about what stalking is, we're going to be defining it, and then we're going to be going through the Domestic Violence and Stalking Act. That is something that we have specifically here in Manitoba, and I'll be talking more about that in detail. We'll go through the types of stalking, and I specifically want to focus on cyberstalking for a little bit. We'll talk about how stalking intersects with other types of violence. We'll talk about protection orders and in what situations you can apply and obtain protection orders. We'll go through some resources for stalking, and then of course all of our contact information will be at the end of the presentation. So what is stalking? We have here in Manitoba something called the Domestic Violence and Stalking Act, which outlines the definition of stalking used here in our province. And it is just below here, taken directly from the Act, and I'll read it out for you now. So stalking occurs when a person without lawful excuse or authority and knowing that another person is harassed or recklessly as to whether the other person is harassed, repeatedly engages in conduct that causes the other person reasonably in all the circumstances to fear for their own safety. So I know that's pretty wordy, but we're going to be going over in detail some different types of stalking. We're going to be doing some examples, so hopefully that'll give you a better idea of what stalking is. But essentially, in Manitoba, it's part of the Domestic Violence and Stalking Act because it is acknowledged that stalking is a large part of lots of people's experiences of domestic violence. And it's important to make sure that we are including it in definitions of domestic violence. And when we talk about gender-based violence and domestic violence, conversations need to include stalking as well. So the Domestic Violence and Stalking Act goes on further to define what kinds of activities are included as stalking. And so again, this is taken directly from the Act, but I'll just read it out for you. The conduct referred to in subsection 2, which was the definition that we just read, includes the person, 1, following from place to place the other person or anyone known to the other person, 2, communicating directly or indirectly with or contacting the other person or anyone known to the other person, 3, using the internet or other electronic means to harass or threaten the other person, 4, besetting or watching any place where the other person or anyone known to the other person resides, works, carries on business, or happens to be, or 5, engaging in threatening conduct directed at the other person or anyone known to the other person. And I think what's important about this kind of expanded definition is that it stipulates that stalking occurs not just when someone's communicating directly with another person in a harassing way, but also indirectly. So reaching out through mutual friends or contacting that person's family members in a harassing way, harassing them at work. So harassing them, but in a way that's through another channel. And also the good thing about this expanded definition is that it highlights the importance of the internet and other electronic means of harassment. And we're going to be going into a little bit more detail on cyber stalking in a little bit because it has become so common and is a really common way for people to experience stalking. So the Criminal Code of Canada also contains the crime of harassment. It's called criminal harassment in the Criminal Code, but that's what we would typically refer to as stalking. And this definition is taken directly from the Criminal Code, but I'll just read it out to you. Criminal harassment. No person shall, without lawful authority and knowing that another person is harassed or recklessly as to whether the other person is harassed, engage in conduct referred to in subsection 2 that causes that other person reasonably in all the circumstances to fear for their safety or the safety of anyone known to them. And then it also goes on to outline prohibited conduct, so just providing examples of what stalking would include. So, for example, the conduct mentioned in subsection 1 consists of A, repeatedly following from place to place the other person or anyone known to them, 2, repeatedly communicating with, either directly or indirectly, the other person or anyone known to them, 3, besetting or watching the dwelling, house, or place where the other person or anyone known to them resides, works, carries on business, or happens to be, or 4, engaging in threatening conduct directed at the other person or any member of their family. So you can see that it's really quite similar to the provincial definition. Again, we're using a different term, criminal harassment, as opposed to stalking. They essentially mean the same thing, so that's really, it doesn't matter that it's a different term. It's just happens to be using different terms. But yeah, the federal definition of stalking and the provincial definition of stalking are really quite similar and include similar things. They highlight that the harassment can be direct or indirect, and it also gives some examples of what stalking could include. What this definition doesn't include is a stipulation related to cyberstalking or using the internet or electronic means to harass or stalk someone. So let's do some stats on stalking now that we have kind of a bit of a grasp of what it is. So more than 1 in 10 women have been targets of stalking in Canada over the course of their life. And when you think about that over the grand scheme of things and the numbers of women in Canada, that is quite a lot. So it's probably reasonable to assume that all of us know somebody who has been touched by stalking in some way in their lifetime. Also important to note that most stalkers know their targets, and we'll go over different types and typologies of stalking and stalkers as we go on. But just like with sexual violence, in situations of sexual violence and sexual assault, the perpetrator is often known to the survivor, and that is the case in stalking as well. So that is something, a thread that we see throughout different types of gender-based violence. It's important for me to note right off the bat that the data on stalking can be hard to gather and collect. Number one, because stalking is often underreported. People typically won't go to the police to report an instance of stalking unless it is quite extreme. And it's also important to note that the data on stalking that statisticians and academics collect on stalking can be difficult for that reason, but then the people like me who go and collect data secondarily and comb through reports and papers and studies on stalking, because of the lack of studies and data and statistics on stalking, it's difficult often for people who collect secondarily, like I do, to find that data. And as a result, the information that we do have on stalking in Canada is typically older information. That doesn't mean that it's inaccurate. We just want to then put a little asterisk by the information to note that it is a little bit older. And so, for example, a lot of the data that we have comes from around like 2008, 2009, and some even a little bit earlier than that. So, for example, in 2009, there have been over 20,000 police reported incidents of stalking. Again, that's going to be something that's underreported. And given that the trends of violent crime have been increasing since 2009, it would be reasonable to assume that rates of stalking have also been increasing since 2009. In 2009, Manitoba actually had the lowest stalking rate of all Canadian provinces, with 22 incidents per 100,000 population, while Prince Edward Island had the highest rate of about 82 incidents per 100,000. And overall, Western Canada had fewer instances of stalking than Eastern Canada did. So that's just important to note. Women account for over 3/4 of all stalking victims, making it a gender-based crime. Often women are targeted far more disproportionately than anyone else. And going back to the idea that most stalkers know their targets, 45% of women stalkers were former intimate partners and 6% were current intimate partners. So you can see that there's a huge proportion of people who are stalking women that are either former intimate partners or current intimate partners. So not only a gender-based crime, but also one of familiarity. So it's not common for targets of stalking to be physically harmed. Often there is psychological and emotional damage done in cases of stalking. although physical harm does happen in approximately 2% of cases, so not a lot, but still a significant number. Most incidents of stalking take place in the home, and about half of stalking cases that reached the courts resulted in a conviction for the stalker. Stalking in the targets of stalking can cause feelings such as self-blame. They might blame themselves for the situation they're experiencing. They might feel shame or low self-esteem if someone's being stalked. They might feel betrayed by the stalker. Of course, they could feel anxiety, fear, depression, and often these are things that last long-term, even after the situation of stalking might have stopped or be paused. Anxiety, fear, and depression are things that linger when we're talking about instances of stalking. Targets often feel anger or helplessness. They feel like there's really a loss of control that they're experiencing, that they can't seem to make it stop. They might lose trust in other people or institutions like the police or the court systems in their ability to make it stop as well. And because of that, they might feel isolated and like they're on their own in this situation of stalking. So we briefly touched on the Domestic Violence and Stalking Act when we were giving some definitions of what stalking is, but we're going to go through it in a little bit more detail to talk about other things that are in the act as well. So this is an act that was passed in 1999, and it is what justice officials in Manitoba use to determine if it's appropriate to grant an order of protection in a given situation. So the Domestic Violence and Stalking Act outlines how a protection order application can be made, who hears the application, and typically that's judicial justices of the peace, JJPs, although there are other types of protective orders that can be issued by the Court of King's Bench, and those are called prevention orders. It's something different, but it's still covered under the Act. However, we're mostly going to be focusing on protection orders rather than prevention orders, because protection orders are the most common tool for targets of stalking to access when they're experiencing a situation of stalking. The Act also outlines what conditions can be placed on somebody if a protection order has been granted. It outlines the rights of the person applying for the order and also of the person who the order is supposed to be against. The Act outlines what kinds of things the JJP, Judicial Justice of the Peace, has to take into account when hearing protection order applications. It outlines how seized property and seized firearms are to be handled in situations of a granted protection order. It says how long a protection order can apply for, the process of appealing a protection order, and then again that different process of prevention orders, which we're not going to focus on, but I just did want to mention that is included as well. So there are multiple different types of stalking, and academics and researchers have kind of divided it into frameworks. So the LAPD has their own particular framework on different types of stalkers. So one, and some of these might be familiar to people, but oftentimes when we see examples of stalking, it's in like fictionalized media, so like TV and movies, and those can be pretty inaccurate. So I just wanted to go over some of the different types of stalking as they actually occur in real life. So the LAPD framework outlines 3 categories of stalkers. The first is a simple obsessional. So they usually have had some kind of relationship with the target, and that's going back to what I said before about most stalkers knowing their target, having known them at some point. And the motivations for a simple obsessional stalker can be revenge. They might be trying to coerce the target into a relationship. They might be delusional about a relationship status and then become obsessed and start stalking. There's the erotomaniac type of stalker, which believes that the target is in love with them, but that there's some kind of external circumstance preventing the target and the stalker from being together. So often the target is of a higher social status than the stalker, although it's not often celebrities. So we're talking things like, when I say higher social status, we're saying that like the stalker might be targeting their doctor or their lawyer or their supervisor at work, somebody who they view as having higher social status than them. The target can also sometimes be a complete stranger, but again, this is not super common, and it's typically the case that the stalker has had some type of relationship with the target, even if it's like the briefest interaction or relationship. And then finally, the LAPD outlines the love obsessional stalker, where the stalker believes they're in love with the target, but in this case, which differs from the erotomaniac, in this case, the stalker doesn't necessarily believe the target loves them in return. The stalker is just believing that they're in love with the target. And that's what kind of differentiates it from the erotomaniac one. There's also something called the recon framework that divides different types of stalkers a little further. A lot of these are similar, although there are some subtle differences. So intimate stalkers is one, and then they're thought to be the most dangerous, perhaps. Again, this is a situation similar to what we talked about before, where a large proportion of stalkers of women are either current or former intimate partners, so they would fall under this category. And in cases of intimate stalkers, the frequency and intensity of their behaviors typically increase over time, and that can really intensify the situation for the target. There are acquaintance stalkers who can try to start a relationship of some kind with a stalker, and this is a situation where the stalker will know their target and have had maybe like a brief interaction with them or some kind of very like casual acquaintance relationship, and then a stalking situation comes out of that. There are public figure stalkers, which, while not as common as TV and movies would have you believe, that it does occasionally happen where celebrities and public figures are stalked and harassed. And then there are private stranger stalkers, which again are not as common by far as stalking situations where the target and the stalker know each other, as that's what happens in the majority of cases. But in some cases, very rare, there will be a private stranger stalker where the target and the stalker have never actually met or had any interaction, but a stalking situation arises regardless. A couple more for the recon framework here. There are physically violent stalkers. And again, I mentioned before that this happens in only about 2% of stalking situations. And in those 2% of situations, the stalking situation is happening because the harasser is very persistent. The relationship or attachment to the target could be more pronounced. And then the stalker may also be, in addition to being physically violent, they may also be verbally threatening or have a history of domestic violence that would cause them to become physically violent with the target that they're stalking. And just briefly, we're going to talk about cyberstalking before we continue on, but it's becoming increasingly common for people to be stalked on the internet. And typically, stalkers will try to gather information about the target through social media and internet before actually commencing the main stalking situation. The target may be not the only target in situations of cyberstalking. And what I mean by that is the stalker might target more than the target themselves. So they might target the target mainly, but they also might go after the target's family members or friends or coworkers as a part of the larger stalking of the main target. And cyberstalking is closely related to offline forms of stalking. So it's often the case where if somebody's experiencing cyberstalking, they're also experiencing some form of stalking offline as well, and both can be happening at the same time. So yeah, let's go into a little bit more detail about cyberstalking, because with increased social media use, having location services on our devices, cyberstalking has become increasingly common and unfortunately increasingly easy for stalkers to undertake. And so examples of cyberstalking can include sending harassing messages, creating multiple accounts under pseudonyms in order for the stalker to track the movements of the target without kind of arising suspicion of having it be under their name. The stalker is likely going to be collecting information on the target's family and friends and coworkers in order to, again, target them as well, and also potentially to blackmail or threaten the initial target by, saying that the stalker has information on their friends or family that could be used against the target. Cyberstalking can include, again, this is due to location services being ubiquitous, finding out the target's home address, where they work, go to school, accessing financial records, tracking their everyday activities, location tracking. These are things that have become increasingly easy due to advances in technology, and stalkers often will exploit the ease of accessing this information in order to increase intensity of stalking behaviors. There also could be instances of cyber smearing, which would be like attempting to tarnish the target's reputation or harm their image by spreading false rumors or spreading lies about them on the internet with the intent of causing harm. And targets of cyber stalking are often harassed by multiple individuals, and this can be because the stalker is encouraging other people to harass the target online, which again results in an increased frequency and intensity of stalking behaviors. Again, just to mention, because I think it's important, that cyber stalking can often lead to offline stalking. So again, if somebody is experiencing cyber stalking, it is likely that they're also experiencing some kind of stalking offline in the real world, as it were. But also it's important to note that cyber stalking emboldens people who wouldn't otherwise commit offline stalking. So because they're hidden behind the computer screen and sheltered behind anonymous usernames, people might feel, and do in fact feel, emboldened to stalk people online and harass people online and engage in cyber stalking. And finally, cyberstalkers might threaten the target with the release of personal information, intimate images, or with contacting other people in the target's life. And that is something that we see in situations of non-consensual distribution of intimate images, which is another webinar that we've done a few months ago. If you want to go back in our videos and look at that one, that is also related to cyberstalking. Stalking is related to other types of violence as well. It often happens at the same time as other crimes. So like stalking could be happening at the same time as voyeurism, can be happening at the same time, again, as the non-consensual distribution of intimate images, which is a crime in Canada. And again, we go over that in more detail in the other video that we did on it a few months ago. Intimidation or threats might be happening. There could be trespassing if someone's being stalked in person, and mischief, which is also a crime, could be happening at the same time as stalking. So protection orders are the most common way for targets of stalking to obtain some kind of distance from the stalker or protection from them. And the process for applying and obtaining protection orders is outlined in the Domestic Violence and Stalking Act that I mentioned earlier. But we're going to go over them in more detail because I think it's really important to understand how protection orders can be applied for and accessed for people who are experiencing domestic violence and stalking. So protection orders are court orders that are issued in emergency situations of stalking or domestic violence when it's been determined that abuse has occurred, that it'll be ongoing, and that it constitutes a pattern of behavior. So those three conditions have to be met in order for a protection order to be granted. And in granting protection orders, courts recognize that the survivor, or in the legal terminology, the applicant, is in need of emergency protection. So protection orders are emergency provisions that are aimed at providing safety for people who are experiencing stalking or domestic violence. Once a protection order has been issued and the documents have been served to the respondent or the stalker or perpetrator of domestic violence in this case, the order doesn't expire for 3 years. So it remains in place once the documents have been put into the hands of the stalker or perpetrator of domestic violence. The order is in effect for 3 years. Protection order documents and applications can be filled out with the help of a protection order designate or a pod. All of the staff at the Women's Resource Center are protection order designates. We've all taken the training about protection orders and are well equipped to assist anybody who needs help filling out a protection order application and accompanying people to the hearings. And then the application must be heard in court before a judicial justice of the peace. And that's the person who's going to be deciding whether or not to grant the order. Once the forms have been filled out, the protection order can be conducted the same day. And that's in recognition of the fact that protection orders are emergency provisions. So it's important that they are able to be accessed as soon as possible. And in the case of protection orders, the perpetrator, or in legal terminology, the respondent, doesn't need to be notified of the hearing, and they won't be. And that's for safety reasons, that a protection order can be obtained against somebody without their knowledge. And it's another safety provision for folks who are applying for protection orders. So protection orders can apply 7 conditions to the applicant, a maximum of 7 conditions. It can be as few as 1, as many as all 7. So 1, the respondent may not communicate with the applicant. 2, and that's in any way, shape, or form, in person, online, indirectly, whatever. Number 2, the respondent may not go near any place that the applicant regularly goes. So that could be their home or their job, their school, their place of worship, somewhere that somebody regularly goes that the respondent would know about. They're not allowed to go there. 3, the respondent can't follow the applicant, and that's, of course, something that's critically important as a condition in situations of stalking. Number 4, the respondent must turn over any weapons, and police may perform a search or seizure on any weapons, and the process for that is outlined further in the Domestic Violence and Stalking Act. Number 5, the respondent must give the applicant their belongings. And number 6, the applicant can get help from the police to retrieve their belongings. So if it's a situation where the person applying for the order is sharing a home with the person that they're wanting the order against, the person who the order is against can't prevent somebody from getting their stuff out of the house. And if need be, they person who's applying for the order has the right to have police accompany them to the home to get their stuff out, so that the respondent isn't interfering with that process. And finally, the applicant can get help from police to remove the respondent from the home if it's been deemed that the respondent should be removed from the home, and that's if it's been deemed that's the safest option. So we're just, as I mentioned, there are multiple types of protective orders. We're going to be focusing on protection orders, but I just wanted to briefly note that there are other types of protective court orders. So prevention orders, those are granted by the Court of King's Bench in Manitoba. So they're not emergency orders. That's a much more lengthy process. And in this case, the order can only be granted after notice is given to the respondent. So in protection order hearings, the respondent is not notified, and that's again for safety reasons because it's an emergency. But in prevention orders, as with any other legal proceeding, the respondent is notified that there's a prevention order application against them. Generally, prevention orders are used in situations where there are concerns coming up during a family court case, and it's not an emergency situation, but it's still a good idea to have that prevention order in place. Prevention orders can include a requirement to attend counseling. So that's something that's different from protection orders, is that that's not one of the 7 conditions that can be applied to a protection order. Prevention orders can require that. And prevention orders are issued by a judge from the Court of King's Bench, so they can add more conditions to the prevention order. It can allow for many more tailored provisions and can be more creative than a protection order in what their conditions are. It can be written into a divorce document, for example, because prevention orders don't expire. So they're like much longer term than protection orders. But the flip side of that is that it's a much longer process to get a prevention order. And it's really not particularly useful in situations where the need for protection is emergent. That's the benefit of protection orders over prevention orders, is that protection orders are granted specifically in emergency situations, and the hearing can be had the same day that paperwork is filed. So after the protection order has been granted, the respondent has 20 days to challenge it and request a set-aside hearing. So a set-aside would be basically just having the protection order thrown out. It's basically an appeal. The respondent has 20 days to appeal the protection order. And once all of the required paperwork for the set-aside hearing has been filed, in the event that the respondent wants to appeal it, the hearing is scheduled, so that can take some time. That's not a same-day process like the actual protection order is. And in set-aside hearings, both parties are present in the room, whereas when we do the initial protection order hearing, it's just the applicant, and the respondent isn't notified until afterwards if the order has been granted. If there are concerns for the applicant's safety, accommodations can be made, so having the applicant and respondent in two separate rooms, security, that kind of thing. During a set-aside hearing, the set-aside hearings go before a judge rather than a JJP. During the hearing, a judge will try to add variations to the existing protection order so that parties can move forward without necessarily having the whole protection order thrown out. For example, the judge might reduce the distance that the respondent has to keep from the applicant. So if the initial protection order said the respondent has to keep 300 meters away from the applicant at all times, the judge might reduce that and say the respondent has to be 150 meters from the applicant at all times. The judge might also allow email contact if there are children, so prohibiting all other forms of contact apart from email only if it's related to children. They might permit drop-offs and pickups of children if the respondent remains in the car. So those kinds of things can be added to the protection order so that the applicant still has the protection order in place and has some form of protection, and this prevents the order from being thrown out altogether. However, in some, not very often, but in some situations, if no resolution can be reached during the set-aside hearing, a prioritized hearing will be scheduled. And in this case, a judge can order evidence be presented via affidavits or oral evidence. And this is a much more lengthy process. It can vary in length, but approximately 30 days after the set-aside hearing, a prioritized hearing would take place. And this is a much more onerous process than just having an application for a protection order and getting it, or having the protection order appealed and then resolved during that initial set-aside hearing. So there are some important considerations for folks considering getting protection orders. The initial protection order hearings, they take place in front of judicial justices of peace, like I mentioned, and they can be done either in person at the courthouse or over the phone or via Zoom. It's pretty much just down to whatever makes the most sense for the situation. Protection orders can actually be applied for on behalf of a minor person or a person who's deemed to be vulnerable by a parent or guardian. So if a child is in need of a protection order, they can have somebody apply for it on their behalf. Children can also be added to protection order applications that an adult is filing for themselves. So, for example, if it's a situation of domestic violence and one parent is applying for a protection order against another parent, the parent who's applying may add the children onto that existing application, that initial application. Again, protection orders are granted without needing to give notice to the respondent, and that is for safety reasons, so that there is no time for the respondent to potentially retaliate against the applicant for going out and trying to get a protection order. The applicant has to provide details about the violence and stalking and why they're afraid. They must also establish that there's a pattern of behavior happening, which includes incidents of coercive and controlling behavior or instances of stalking. That can be pretty traumatic for people to go through, and why we recommend having a protection order designate help fill out that application, they're able to walk you through the process and just kind of make it go a little more smoothly. And finally, they must explain why they're fearful, why they believe the violence they're stalking will continue, why they feel they're in need of immediate emergent protection, and be able to demonstrate, again, that the violence has become part of a pattern of worsening behavior. So these are all conditions set out in the Domestic Violence and Stalking Act that have to be met in order for a protection order to be granted. There's no fee to apply for a protection order. It's, again, something that is issued on an emergent basis, so we don't want to have fees preventing people from applying for emergent protection. However, if there is a move to remove the protection order or apply for a variance, there's a fee for that. And again, only the 7 specific conditions that I mentioned previously can be included in a protection order. They are valid for up to 3 years unless otherwise stated by the Judicial Justice of the Peace. If there's an existing protection order that's about to expire, so your 3 years are almost up, a new order needs to be applied for no less than 3 months prior to that expiration date. Otherwise, there will be a lapse in between protection orders if a new one is granted prior to that, or sorry, after that 3 months prior to the expiration date. And if the order is not granted, the applicant can't apply again until a new incident has occurred, which is really unfortunate that somebody has to wait to experience violence or stalking again in order to apply for a protection order. But it's important to know that and have that in the back of your head if you're considering applying for a protection order. So let's go through the hearing process, because that can be something that not a lot of people are familiar with, and having some information could be pretty useful for some folks on what a protection order hearing looks like, and some important considerations just, again, to keep in the back of your head. Everything that happens during a hearing is recorded, and for that reason, JJPs advise the applicant to refrain from giving personal details, because after a hearing has taken place, whether or not the application is granted, a respondent is able to obtain a copy of that transcript after the fact. And oftentimes they may try to weaponize what is put in that transcript. So we don't want to be giving any more personal details than is absolutely necessary. The applicant might be given additional opportunities to provide information by giving oral evidence during the hearing. Witnesses can provide evidence either written or orally, and that is at the discretion of the JJP if they determine that there's more information that's needed in order to decide if a protection order should be granted. If the order is granted, a copy will be given to an applicant, and then after that, the JJP will arrange for the respondent to be served with the protection order by like a sheriff's officer or RCMP or Winnipeg Police or something like that. And once the papers of the protection order hit the hands of the respondent and they're served with it officially, the protection order is immediately in effect. Doesn't matter if they've had time to read it or not. Doesn't matter if they didn't know. Again, because protection orders are issued in emergency situations, that order takes effect immediately as soon as the protection order papers are served to the respondent and hit their hands. Another consideration for protection orders is that, especially for the way that we do things at the Women's Resource Center, if we're helping somebody apply for a protection order, that's only half of the process. The other half is creating a safety plan to go with that protection order. And that is for the reason that we want to provide the opportunity for the safest possible exit from a situation of domestic violence or stalking. And safety planning is a critical component of protection order planning that shouldn't be overlooked. Protection orders are only part of a plan that somebody needs to stay safe when they're experiencing domestic violence or stalking, and the other part of that is safety planning. And those are going to vary based on people's individual circumstances. So, for example, things like where the survivor lives earlier in a city, that's going to affect what their safety plan looks like, whether they have access to a vehicle, their level of access to finances, whether there are children in the home. All of those things are going to make the safety plans unique to the individual. So some of the things that we take into consideration when helping somebody construct a safety plan, we might suggest some of these things. This is not, of course, an exhaustive list, but often these are included in the safety plan. So we'll suggest changing up your typical routine, altering your social media presence, locking down accounts, making things private, changing passwords, changing phone numbers or email addresses, like unlisting your phone number, making sure you have go bags packed with the essentials ready to go. So clothes, medications, documents, copies of documents, keys. If there are kids around, teaching them how to dial 911 and run to a neighbor for help. Maybe there's a safety word that they are taught that tells them that they need to hide or leave. We'd recommend planning somewhere to go. So a shelter, a friend's house, family's house, somewhere where you know you're going to be safe. And finally, keeping all essential documents in one safe place. So things that like passports, driver's licenses, health cards, things that would allow you to access your bank accounts, all of those kinds of things. We want all essential documents to always be in one safe place so that they can't be taken. And also you're going to want to make sure that you have copies of all of those documents stored in different places, so that if somebody gets a hold of one set of documents or copies, then there are others. So let's go over some resources finally before we wrap it up. So there is an organization called SPARC, the Stalking Prevention Awareness and Resource Center, and their website, linked here and also in the description below, has a lot of great information on stalking, resources for folks who are experiencing stalking, toolkits, all of that good stuff. There's also a book by a women's rights activist named Julie Lalonde. It's called The Life, Death, and Life of Julie S. Lalonde, and she details her experience of being stalked by a former intimate partner over the course of over 10 years. So if you're looking to understand a real life example of what a stalking situation looks like, that's a really great book. It's not super long. It's really well written, and I would highly recommend that one. Also, maybe take a look at what some protection order designate agencies in your community are. So we're one, the Women's Resource Center is one. All of our staff have been trained as PODs, as I mentioned. There's also the Handbook for Police and Crown Prosecutors on Criminal Harassment, and that is from the Federal Department of Justice. It's not a terribly technical read. It's just got some really good information on criminal harassment, some information on safety planning, and then also related to safety planning is the criminal harassment little booklet that's online by the Canadian Resource Center for Victims of Crime, and they go over how to protect yourself if you're experiencing stalking, how to ensure that you're living as safely as possible. And it is really unfortunate that the onus for living safely falls on the targets or victims of crime rather than on the people who are perpetrating the crime. But that is the lay of the land, unfortunately, at the moment. And these resources should help folks to not only understand stalking a little bit better, but also give people tools and resources for dealing with stalking if that's something that they or somebody close to them is experiencing. And as always, here's our contact information. We are available at the number and email address below. Please don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions, comments, or concerns. And we will see you next month for our next episode.